My husband had been in the ground for less than an hour when my stepdaughter walked to the front of the funeral reception, lifted a champagne glass, and announced to hundreds of guests, "The $33 million estate is now officially mine. My father made sure his real family was taken care of, and that does not include his wife." People gasped. Some turned to look at me in shock. I stood there frozen, heartbroken, and humiliated. But then our lawyer stepped forward, smiled, and said, "She's right, unless we read what's on page 7. And that was the moment everything changed. My name is Isabella Grant, and the day I buried my husband was the most painful day of my life. Charles was not just my husband. He was my best friend, my protector, and the man who taught me that love is meant to heal, not control. We met later in life, both having already lived through loss. When he asked me to marry him, he said, "There is no timeline for true love. When you find peace in someone's presence, you hold on to it." Those words stayed in my heart for every year we spent together. From the moment I entered his family, his daughter Vivian made it clear she considered me an outsider. She was his only child from his first marriage, and she believed everything Charles owned was her birthright. She tolerated me in public, but never accepted me in private. Charles often told me, "Give her time. One day she will see your heart." I tried to believe him. Over the years, Charles built a legacy admired by the entire country. He was a man of strong morals, deeply respected in every community. People admired his leadership and generosity. But what many did not know was that his greatest concern was not who would receive his wealth, but who would carry his values. In private moments, he often said, "Money does not make someone worthy of inheritance. Character does." Charles fell gravely ill 2 months before his death. As his wife, I stayed by his bedside day and night, holding his hand, reading to him, and praying. Vivian visited only twice. The first time, she arrived with real estate brochures and asked if he planned to transfer the estate before passing. The second time, she became frustrated that he was unable to speak and left within 10 minutes. Still, I never imagined she would do what she did on the day of his funeral. The funeral was attended by over 300 people, family, political figures, business partners, members of charity foundations, and people whose lives Charles had changed. The air was filled with grief, but also admiration for the legacy he left behind. I was standing beside Michael, my son from my first marriage, who had always loved Charles as his own father. He whispered, "Mom, remember his word. He never made a careless decision. Trust him." But grief has a way of breeding fear. As I stood looking at Charles's portrait beside his coffin, a voice in my head whispered, "What if he left everything?" To Vivian, "What if you no longer have a home?" I tried to silence those thoughts. Charles had always been deliberate, thoughtful, intelligent, but beneath my faith was a quiet trembling. After the burial, we moved into the reception hall. The room was filled with people offering condolences. Some were genuinely grieving. Others had already begun whispering about inheritance, property rights, and control of the business empire. I heard one woman say, "Vivian will be the richest unmarried woman in the country now." Another whispered, "His wife will have to move out of the estate. She is not legally blood." I felt my hands go cold, but I stood with dignity. I had promised Charles I would not let fear control me. I looked toward the doors, waiting for the lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, who had been Charles's legal advisor and friend for 20 years. He arrived quietly, carrying a thick folder. Before he could speak, Vivian walked to the center of the room with confidence. She tapped her glass and raised her voice so everyone could hear. "I want to thank you all for attending my father's funeral," she said, pretending to wipe a tear. "As of today, I am the official heir of the Grant estate. The properties, the company, the assets. All of it now belongs under my leadership." Guests turned toward me, some in shock, others with pity. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Michael stepped forward to defend me, but Jonathan raised a hand, signaling him to wait. Vivian smiled at the crowd, then turned to me and said, "Don't worry, Isabella. You will not be left on the streets. I'll arrange a small living allowance. You can stay in the guest house until we decide what to do with you." Before I could respond, Jonathan Pierce stepped forward, holding up the will. His voice was calm, but firm. He said, "What she said is true. unless we read page 7, and that is where the real story begins. If you believe truth always rises in the end, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because what happens on page 7 will leave you speechless. The room went completely silent as Jonathan held the will in his hands, his eyes calmly scanning the crowd before landing on Vivian, who was already smiling as if she had won. My heart was pounding, not from greed or fear of losing money, but from the sheer disbelief that on the very day I laid my husband to rest, his daughter felt entitled to publicly humiliate me. Vivian lifted her chin and said loudly, "There is no need to drag this on. My father made it clear that bloodline inheritance cannot be challenged." Some guests murmured in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I stood motionless, my fingers gripping the edge of a chair to keep from collapsing. Vivian continued, her voice rising with confidence. "My father trusted me with his empire because he knew I was a visionary. Isabella was his companion, but she was never his. Legacy." The words pierced me deeper than any weapon ever could. My son Michael stepped forward, his voice filled with anger. "Show some respect," he said, but Vivian only gave him a smug, dismissive smile. Jonathan held up his hand, signaling everyone to be seated. "Ms. Grant," he said evenly, "you are correct that you are named in the will, but you are also correct that there is one section that has not been shared with this audience." Vivian rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Just get on with it." Jonathan nodded and turned to page 7. He took a breath and read aloud, "In the event that my daughter, Vivian Grant, displays any act of hostility, disrespect, or intent to remove my wife, Isabella Grant, from the estate or business, this will become subject to the secondary clause outlined on the following page." There was a wave of gasps through the ballroom. Vivian blinked rapidly, then laughed sarcastically. "That is impossible. My father would never question my loyalty." But Jonathan was not finished. He continued reading. "This clause was written because I, Charles Grant, fully anticipated the possibility of conflict after my passing. It is not blood that determines who inherits my life's work. It is loyalty, compassion, and the protection of the values I built this family upon." The words echoed through the room like thunder. Vivian's smile disappeared. Guests began turning their heads, whispering. She took a step toward the lawyer and said sharply, "This is outrageous. You forged that." Jonathan met her eyes calmly and said, "This will was recorded, notarized, and signed in the presence of 3 witnesses, including your father's personal physician." Vivian's voice rose in panic. "There is no proof I've done anything wrong." And that is when Jonathan set the folder on the table, opened another document, and said, "Your father spent the last months of his life writing letters and directives in anticipation of exactly this moment." Jonathan then read a letter written in Charles's own handwriting. As his voice carried through the hall, I felt my knees weaken, not from fear, but from the powerful realization that my husband had known. He had seen through Vivian's mask long before I did. The letter stated, "If Vivian attempts to remove my wife, diminish her dignity, or claim any portion of the estate before a formal reading of this document, she will be disinherited immediately, with full control and ownership reverting to my beloved wife, Isabella." Vivian's face went from pale to flushed red. She shouted, "This is character assassination." Jonathan remained composed and replied, "The clause activates immediately based on the public claim you just made, witnessed by over 300 individuals." You could feel the energy in the room shift. The same people who moments earlier were looking at Vivian as the rightful heir were now shifting their attention to me, not with pity, but with respect. Vivian attempted to regain control and said, "This does not mean anything. My father always intended for me to lead the company." Jonathan closed the document and looked at her with finality. "Your father's intention was not to give power to whoever wanted it most. It was to give it to the person who would protect his legacy, not destroy it." Vivian looked around the room desperately, waiting for someone to defend her. No one spoke. The silence was not in her favor. At that moment, I saw something break inside her, not sadness or regret, but the realization that every plan she had made was slipping out of her hands. She turned to me, eyes blazing with anger and disbelief, and said, "You manipulated him." Before I could speak, Michael stepped between us and said, "No, you revealed who you are, and Dad knew exactly what kind of person you had become." The tension in that room was no longer about inheritance. It was about truth finally standing up to arrogance. Vivian had made her move, confident that no one could challenge her. What she never expected was that Charles had already anticipated this day and written the final chapter himself. As Jonathan closed the folder containing my husband's letter, the tension in the room turned into a thick silence that settled over every single person watching. Vivian stood frozen, her earlier arrogance now replaced with panic, but still clinging to the hope that there was a loophole. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and said loudly, "My father would never sign away an entire empire without telling me directly. This document must be incomplete." But Jonathan was prepared. With calm certainty, he opened a second sealed envelope and said, "There is more. Your father anticipated your objection and requested that this be read if anyone challenges his decision." The room leaned in. I felt my heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from a deep knowing that the truth was finally stepping into the light. Jonathan unfolded the final letter, written in Charles's own handwriting. His voice was steady as he read, "Vivian, if you are hearing this, then you have chosen pride over family and control over compassion. I love you as my daughter, but inheritance is not simply granted by blood. It is earned through character. A leader serves, not demands." At those words, Vivian's expression cracked, and she looked around wildly for support. But the guests who once whispered about her becoming the next heiress were now avoiding her gaze. Jonathan continued, "I have chosen to protect my wife, Isabella, because she honored me in sickness and in health. She carried the weight of my suffering with grace, not expectation. Therefore, effective immediately, Isabella is the full executor and beneficiary of the estate." A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Vivian's face contorted with rage. "You manipulated him while he was weak," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. Before I could respond, Jonathan held up a hand and said, "Your father recorded this message while fully conscious 3 weeks before his passing." He then pressed play on a small audio recorder. The room filled with Charles's voice, clear, steady, and composed. "If anyone suggests I was not in my right mind, let this serve as proof that every decision I made was with full clarity and intention. My estate will be governed by the person who protected my heart, not the one who waited for it to stop beating." The impact of those words was immediate. Vivian's shoulders collapsed as if the ground beneath her had given way. I watched as every ounce of false power drained from her face, leaving behind the truth she had refused to acknowledge. She had not lost the inheritance at the funeral. She had lost it the moment she chose entitlement over love. Jonathan then turned the page and revealed the next clause. Additionally, Mr. Grant established an irrevocable trust funded with $33 million. The trust will be used to support charitable foundations, medical research, and scholarships in his name. Isabella Grant has full authority to distribute these funds as she sees fit. Once Mrs. Grant passes, the trust will transfer to Michael Grant, provided he continues to honor the values set forth by his father. Vivian's mouth fell open in disbelief. She looked at Michael as if seeing him for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as the rightful heir. But there was one final surprise. Jonathan revealed a handwritten note addressed to Vivian. He read aloud, "Vivian, if you choose reconciliation, you will always have a place in this family, not as its ruler, but as a member willing to serve. However, any further attempt to undermine my wife or destroy our legacy will result in permanent legal and personal separation." Vivian's bravado shattered. She sank into her chair, staring at the floor, the weight of her choices finally breaking through the walls she had built around herself for years. Some guests were in tears. Others nodded quietly, as if justice had reached into the room and taken its rightful place. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel. Relief, not because of wealth, but because my husband had not left me alone in this battle. He had fought for me even after his death. I stood in that moment, not as a widow seeking mercy, but as the woman my husband had trusted to carry on his name. And in that realization, something inside me awakened. I was no longer standing in the shadow of grief. I was stepping into the legacy of truth. As Jonathan placed the final page on the table, a ripple of disbelief moved across the entire room. What moments earlier had been a celebration of Vivian's assumed victory had now turned into a public revelation of truth. I could feel every eye on, not with pity, but with respect. Vivian, still standing near the podium, seemed frozen in place, like a performer who had forgotten her lines in front of a live audience. The silence was heavy, almost sacred, until she suddenly slammed her hand on the table and shouted, "This is not over. I will fight this in court. My father wanted me to lead. I am his blood." Jonathan did not flinch. He calmly reached down and lifted a sealed envelope with a blue ribbon and gold seal, the unmistakable signature of the state probate office stamped across it. "This estate has already been reviewed by the court," he announced, "and legally transferred according to Mr. Grant's private directives. You may challenge it, but the only thing you will achieve is the exposure of your own misconduct. There are recordings, bank transfers, and email evidence showing you were planning to sell assets before your father was even buried." Gasps echoed through the room. Vivian's face turned white. She looked around the crowd desperately, searching for someone to side with her, but no one moved. Even those who once aligned themselves with her for social advantage now lowered their heads, unwilling to be seen supporting her after such a revelation. My son, Michael, stepped closer to me, placing his hand over mine. His voice was steady as he spoke to the room. "My father believed leadership was an act of service. He didn't build this fortune to feed someone's ego. He built it to leave a legacy of honor." Guests nodded in agreement. The lawyer turned one final page and said, "There is one more instruction from Mr. Grant that must be read publicly." Vivian, visibly trembling, whispered, "What more could there possibly be?" Jonathan read, "If my wife, Isabella, is ever publicly disrespected or humiliated by any member of this family during my funeral or the execution of my will, that person will not only lose their inheritance, but will be legally required to vacate all family properties within 72 hours and will be permanently removed from any leadership roles tied to my name." The room filled with murmurs. Vivian stepped back as if struck. The reality of her actions came crashing down on her in front of everyone. Her arrogance had activated her own downfall. She looked at me with eyes full of fury and disbelief. "He loved me. He wouldn't do this," she muttered. Jonathan replied gently, "He loved you enough to give you a choice, but today you showed him, and all of us, who you truly are." With that, Jonathan retrieved a small envelope addressed in Charles's handwriting, sealed with wax. He handed it to me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a note, written in my husband's familiar cursive. "My Isabella, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, but I remain with you in every breath you take. I know there will be moments where others try to erase your place beside me, but know this: there is no legacy without you. This estate is not a prize to be claimed. It is a life we built together, and it belongs in the hands of the one whose love shaped every wall of it. Protect our name not with force, but with grace, and let the world see that loyalty outlives greed." Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief that Charles had not been blind. He had seen everything, and he had made sure I would not face this battle alone. The guests, many of whom had known Charles for decades, rose to their feet in a silent show of respect, not as a performance, but as a testament to his words and his wisdom. Vivian looked around helplessly, her once confident demeanor gone. She tried one last attempt to regain control, her voice shaking. "This is unfair. You knew he was old and vulnerable." Jonathan firmly replied, "Your father recorded a video statement 6 days before his death, in full health of mind. That video is archived with the court and confirms every decision documented here." He then turned toward the large screen at the front of the room. "Would you like to play it now?" Vivian's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair. "No," she whispered, voice cracked with defeat. She knew the truth was undeniable. The atmosphere shifted completely. Guests began approaching me, offering words of support and admiration, not for wealth, but for the dignity with which the situation had been handled. My son put his arm around me and said quietly, "Dad trusted you with everything, and today he showed the world why." In that moment, the pain of losing my husband transformed into the strength of carrying his purpose. I had not only been protected, I had been chosen. And as Vivian sat in silence, overwhelmed by the consequences of her own choices, I realized that this was not a story of inheritance. This was a story of truth, reclaiming its rightful place in front of the world. As the guests slowly began to disperse from the reception, I stood quietly near the portrait of my late husband, feeling the last echoes of his presence wrap around me like a warm embrace. What had begun as the worst day of my life, burying the man I loved, had transformed into a moment of truth that restored not only my dignity, but the very soul of our family legacy. There were no cheers, no celebration, only a deep, collective understanding among those present that what had happened was not about money. It was about justice, loyalty, and the power of doing what is right, even when no one is watching. Vivian remained seated alone, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the pride that once drove her had evaporated, leaving behind a woman confronted by the consequences of her own choices. For a brief moment, I looked at her not as a rival or threat, but as a lost soul, someone who could have inherited not only wealth, but love, if only she had chosen humility over control. Whether she would ever find her way back from that loss was no longer in my hands. Over the next few days, the estate transitioned into my sole authority. Papers were signed, legal seals were placed, and the court confirmed my position as executor of everything Charles and I had built. But I did not feel triumphant. I felt responsible. Charles had entrusted this legacy not to elevate me, but to allow me to protect it from being corrupted. I walked through each room of our home with fresh eyes, not seeing material luxury, but memories. The piano where Charles played every Christmas. The study where he wrote letters to people he mentored without ever publicly taking credit. The garden we planted together during our first year of marriage. This estate was never just about money. It was our life story, carved into stone and soil. And now, I was its guardian. My first decision was not to lock it away, but to open it. I established the Charles Grant Foundation for Integrity and Leadership, turning part of our estate into a center for young entrepreneurs and community leaders to learn ethics, responsibility, and humanitarian leadership. I wanted the world to know that a man's legacy is not defined by the wealth he leaves behind, but by the values he leaves in others. Michael stepped up with grace that brought tears to my eyes. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for control. Instead, he asked, "Mom, how can I help you carry Dad's vision forward?" In that moment, I realized that Charles had not only chosen his heir wisely, he had raised one in the form of my son. Together, we worked side by side to create programs that supported widows, funded education for children who lost parents, and assisted seniors who had no one to care for them. While Vivian had believed wealth was a throne, we chose to use it as a bridge. And in doing so, we felt closer to Charles than ever before. As for Vivian, she was given 72 hours to leave the property. She did not fight legally because she knew every document, every recording, every handwritten word from her father was undeniable. On the morning she left, I watched from a distance as she walked down the long driveway with a single suitcase, shoulders slumped. Not in anger this time, but in something that looked like awakening. She turned once to look back at the house. Our eyes met. There were no words exchanged, but in that moment, I silently prayed that losing money would teach her to find herself. In the months that followed, people from all over the country began writing letters to me. Some who had lost everything to family betrayal, others who had been stripped of dignity in their old age. They told me my story gave them strength to speak up for themselves. I realized then that what happened to me was bigger than inheritance or property. It was a message to anyone who has ever been silenced, anyone who has ever been told they are replaceable, anyone who has ever been cast aside in a moment of vulnerability. I had not just inherited an estate, I had inherited a voice. Today, as I sit in the garden watching the sun set over the home my husband built and I now protect, I feel no bitterness, only purpose. My heart is not heavy, it is full. Because this is the truth I hope every person hears. People can try to take what you own, but they cannot take what you are unless you give it to them. Legacy is not about who stands at the podium claiming victory. It is about who stands in truth when the world is watching. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because your voice matters and your story could be the next one that changes lives.